When it reaches 1.2 gigawatts, when it's fully built out as a campus, how much will you have invested in the site? And how much will then the customers have invested? And what will be the total envelope of the money?
So a normal metric that we generally work to is around 10 million euros per megawatt. Now, because we're building at such a large scale, we should be able to develop it at slightly lower than 10 million a megawatt. So our latest estimates are coming in at about 10 billion euros just for the physical infrastructure of the data center. That's over the 1.2 gigawatts. And then we expect our customers to bring in their GPUs, their CPUs, their IT equipment. That's generally around 4 times as much. So we're looking at 40 billion of IT equipment going in to add on to the 10 billion that we're spending.
Hello, I'm Michael Liebreich, and this is Cleaning Up. And today we're bringing you the second of our on-location episodes from Sines in Portugal. I'm here as the guest of Start Campus, a portfolio company of one of our Leadership Circle members, Davidson Kempner. And they are building a huge data center right here. The first phase is up and running. That's just 29 megawatts. But ultimately, this location will be hosting 1.2 gigawatts of data center capacity. And it's a really interesting location because this used to be a coal-fired power station. And so we're going from coal to AI. I have got lots of questions. What does it take to build a facility like this? How do you make sure it's a good data center with all these projects proliferating around the world? What is the business model of the data center sector? How do you make sure that something like this plays nicely with the locals and also with the grid? I'm going to be putting those questions and more to Rob Dunn, the CEO of Start Campus. Please welcome Rob Dunn to Cleaning Up. Before we get started, since recording in Portugal in October, Microsoft has announced that it will be making a $10 billion investment in the Start Campus Sines data center. That's a real vote of confidence in the work that Rob and his team have been doing, as well as in the foresight of his backers. Rob, thank you very much for not just joining us here on Cleaning Up, but also showing us around your baby.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Let's start, as we always do. Can you explain in your own words, who are you and what is it exactly that you're doing here?
Okay, so I'm Rob Dunn. I'm the CEO of Start Campus. We're here in Portugal building Europe's largest and most sustainable data center. So we're sitting today in the battery room of our first data center, the first of 6 large data centers in a town called Sines in Portugal. And our ambition is to grow massive scale data centers in a very sustainable way to support our customer base. And I'm sure you're hearing a lot about the AI and other workloads that are growing that huge demand at the moment. We're here to support those customers for the long term.
You said we're here in a battery room of a data center, and I have to say that every so often the fans go on and go off because you are already operating here. So you've got some operations. We'll hear exactly what you've got so far, but the fans go on. That's presumably somebody just kind of is making a cat video or doing something, and we get the fan noise, right?
No, exactly. It's very important. We're sitting in a battery room. These batteries, to ensure longevity, need to remain in 22 to 24 degrees Celsius. So those air fans that you hear at the moment are there to support that. But yeah, we've been operational since about September last year. We started building this data center in 2022. First data center was designed originally to be 14 megawatts, and now due to over demand by customers and the increasing capacity that NVIDIA is pushing out every year, we've managed to double that capacity. So what you've seen today is us in a new phase of construction. This data center is not only operational, but it's also being expanded at the same time.
But when you say this data center, the campus, I think it's really an astonishing thing for me. The building we're in is 14 growing to 29 megawatts, and it's immense, right? We've just been walking around looking at it, but it's also only 2.5% of what will eventually be on the campus.
Exactly. So
the campus is going to be 1.2 gigawatts?
Yeah, so this might look like a big building, but this is our baby in the big scheme of things. The entire campus, once it's built out, will be 1.2 gigawatts of IT load, making it, as I said before, the biggest data center in Europe. And I can say that with confidence, knowing it's the only one that's got more than a gigawatt of power capacity delivered by the grid.
So I've got a bunch of questions that I want to run through in terms of why data centers, how the business model works, what makes a good one, and how do the locals react, and so on. But before we do, let's just to give a bit of context. I actually was involved in this project in a funny way before you joined to run it, and that was back in 2021 when the investors, so that's our Cleaning Up Leadership Circle member Davidson Kempner, and also a company called an investor called Pioneer Point, they wanted to raise the profile and float the idea that the future of data centers were not in Europe, was not Frankfurt, London, Paris, Dublin, Amsterdam, but actually would be outside towns, and they'd be absolutely enormous. And kind of nobody was engaging with this idea. It seems extraordinary today, but people thought that data centers needed to be in cities because of latency. And so I edited and helped to write a report about what we dubbed green giant data centers. And we launched it at the Glasgow COP in 2021, November 2021, this report. And it was a sort of a desperate attempt to get people to understand that data centers needed to be really big and really clean, really renewable, and use lots of existing assets and so on. And I think it kind of did its job, because here we are.
Well, I think now it's proving to be very true, isn't it? So I first read that report in 2021. I met the guys from Davidson Kempner. I was in a pretty comfortable job. I spent 10 years at a company called Digital Realty, building data centers all around Europe in those cities, in those markets that everybody knows about, the cloud markets. They call it the FLAP-D, which is Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin. This is where traditionally all the data centers were being built in Europe. And a lot of those were, 40, 50, maybe even 100 megawatts at the time. That was a bit of a stretch. When I heard about this project from Davidson Kempner, and then they introduced me to the Green Giant paper, I could see that there was a huge amount of ambition there, and it made sense. It made sense that these things were going to grow, and it made sense, if we could, to grow them in a smaller number of locations where you could get all the great attributes of renewable low-cost power, great connectivity, and potentially even amazing cooling solution as well.
And I think it's important to remember, because it's so easy to kind of index on today. This was before ChatGPT. It was before the AI boom or bubble, depending on how you want to see it. But before there's clearly elements of both. But it was before all of that, which is why we didn't call it core AI data, so we called it these green giants. But we spent a lot of time on how these huge data centers would play nicely with the grid and with local communities. So I want to get onto that. But first, let's just sort of dive into what does it take to build, a 29 megawatt data center, but really that's only the pilot for this, gigawatt scale data centers. What do you actually have to build? So, when you arrive, there's there's nothing. What do? You are the guy who does this. So what do you first do?
Exactly. It takes a lot of planning and a lot of design work, a lot of permitting. You spend 2-3 years planning these projects before you even break ground. And then once you do, you've got to make sure you have everything lined up so that they can go at speed. And it's across the board. You need to make sure the structure is well designed to support the growing data center loads that we have. I walked around today, I showed you the floor we're on here. That supports a 2 to 3 ton rack. And we could have hundreds of those in a small location. So it needs to be very well designed.
So when you said loads there, you mean literally physically the weight?
The actual weight of these racks. They're very heavy things and they need to be rolled around.
How big is your campus area and how big is this building, just in terms of square meters or acres or something?
So we're on 64 hectares of land here. And the first building is on about a 10 hectare plot.
Now, if it's going to be 2.5% of the compute or of the megawatts, gigawatts, but it's already 10 hectares out of 64. So is that because there's just so much? You've got to build roads and you've got to build all the kind of lots of infrastructure that...
Exactly. There's a lot of common infrastructure that gets put in the first building, but you'll also note that there's this first building does take up quite a decent footprint, and we've got a lot of flexibility built into it because it's our first building, and that's actually paid dividends to us. We've been able to double the capacity from the original design, and we'll probably end up adding more capacity as we go. The future buildings are very efficiently designed. They're 2 stories as well, so we're trying to get all of the data hall space on a single floor, and then all of the electrical infrastructure up on the first floor away from the IT space where we can. So it just maximizes the use of that plot.
Okay, but back to the building. So it's got to sustain the loads, the actual physical weight of not just the racks, but you've got a lot of the cooling equipment, and also this is pretty heavy engineering. There was a big earthquake that destroyed Lisbon in 17 something something. There's actually a museum. If anybody listening to this comes to Lisbon, there is a museum where you can sit in a chair and it'll shake you around and frighten the what's-its out of you. Probably in your role, it would frighten you rather more than most people. Are you not worried about earthquakes?
A little bit, but I've built in a number of zones that have minor earthquakes from time to time, and we designed the data centers in all of those areas to withstand those tremors. You can see as you walk around the strong supports that we put in place so that all the pipework, all the electrical equipment, all the IT equipment is well supported so things aren't loose and they fall around if there's...
So if there is an earthquake during the filming of this episode, we will just continue. We'll just we'll just wait a little bit and no break, just continue, and everything will be, all the little blinking lights, everything will be fine, right?
Exactly.
So let's just put this in context, though. The reason you want this thing to just keep operating, irrespective of anything, of course, for resilience of what's going on in the servers, but also it's a very expensive facility you're building. Can you just tell us how much, because you are building the building and the cooling and some of the electrical infrastructure, which we'll get into, and then your customers are filling it with the GPUs, with the chips, with all the equipment. How much is, when it reaches 1.2 gigawatts, when it's fully built out as a campus, how much will you have invested in the site, and how much will then the customers have invested, and what will be the total envelope of the money?
So a normal metric that we generally work to is around 10 million euros per megawatt. Now, because we're building at such a large scale, we should be able to develop it at slightly lower than 10 million a megawatt. So our latest estimates are coming in at about 10 billion euros just for the physical infrastructure of the data center. That's over the 1.2 gigawatts. And then we expect our customers to bring in their GPUs, their CPUs, their IT equipment. That's generally around 4 times as much. So we're looking at 40 billion of IT equipment going in to add on to the 10 billion that we're spending.
I was just doing mental arithmetic. You do, so you do 10 billion euros, so that's whatever it is, $12 billion dollars, and then you multiply that by 5 to get the total. So it's a $60 billion facility. When will that be done? What are your phases that you're going through? Because obviously this is 29 megawatts. This is the first 2.5% of that, and it's already operating in part. When does this building get finished? And then you've got presumably 4 or 5, and they get bigger and bigger, I'm going to guess,
exactly.
Each time.
So the upgrade of this building will be finished in the early part of next year, call it March, April. But at the same time, we're starting the next building. So we'll be breaking ground on the next building in the next few months. And customer demand willing, we should have that finished by 2027 and rolling into the following buildings as we're still building out the next one. So we're aiming for about a 6 to 9 month stagger, start to start, which allows us to finish all 5 buildings by 2030.
2030, so another 5 years. And you broke ground when? Because you joined just before the groundbreaking, I believe.
Exactly. Yeah. Almost the day I joined, we were breaking ground on this building, and that was in early 2022.
And the prep work, those permitting and so on, that had already happened. How much of the detailed engineering design had already happened?
For the first building, the detailed engineering was already there, and it was ready to start building. So the contractors were already on board. The master planning was then done for the rest of the campus.
So it's 8 years to get to 1.2 gigawatts.
Effectively.
Okay, to do through the staggered stages and so on.
Effectively, okay. Yes.
Now let's dive into just a few of the other systems that you're putting in, because you're doing a lot of electrical engineering. There have been a lot of electricians involved here. I can just tell that from the walkthrough. But also you've got some innovative approaches to cooling, which are ultimately going to make this a very good and very low cost data center, right?
Exactly.
Okay, Rob, there's pipes everywhere. Where are we? What's happening here?
Okay, so this is our mechanical plant room. So this is where all the cooling happens for the data center. We have a combination of technologies in here. The more traditional chillers and outside the cooling towers.
So chillers over there behind those
over
boards.
there, we're protecting them while we're under construction.
Right.
So these are more traditional, been in data centers for almost 20 years, and they'll provide the heat rejection for normal air cooling like any old data center will have. We've only brought that in as a backup for our first building, just while we were testing the seawater, the cooling technology. So our primary and future-facing technology is this seawater cooling. What you can see behind me here is a bunch of heat exchangers. They're titanium plated that allow the seawater to pass through and then reject out to the ocean. And on the process cooling water side, they then allow us to chill down the air that gets pumped into the data center. And it's doing that at about a 1.1 PUE, which basically means it's about 3 to 4 times more efficient than these old chillers and cooling towers that we have.
PUE, acronyms.
Power usage effectiveness.
Power usage. So that's the ratio of the power that comes into the building that actually goes into the chips versus being used to power all of this
exactly.
equipment.
So for a megawatt of IT load, if we use 100 kilowatts to cool it down, that's a 1.1 PUE. So cooling is a big part of the infrastructure we need to put in to make sure those racks can operate no matter what happens. Traditionally, it would be air cooling at the rack level that would provide the support to keep those racks at 24 to 26 degrees. And then you need to have a heat rejection mechanism. Traditionally, that would be a combination of chillers and cooling towers. And that can be quite expensive, not only in terms of the installation cost, but also the operational cost. Now we have some of that infrastructure here, but we call that our backup system. Our primary system for heat rejection is a seawater cooling system. That's been used in data centers all around the world for many, many years. I've installed that in London. It was more from the dock than from the sea. There's similar examples in Marseille and Finland of this being used. It's a very effective way of cooling the data center. You can basically keep the rack cool by using 3 times less of the power to do so.
So you have got here, though, in this building, you've got duplicate system. You've got the air chillers and you've got the seawater cooling. So and each of them could completely deal with the heat load of this building, right?
Effectively, yes. We did that just to make sure that everything operationally will be working with the seawater before we decide eventually to go 100% on seawater for this building and for the rest of the campus.
So ultimately, this one's got duplicate air and seawater, but the later ones will have duplicate seawater and seawater, because you've always got to have duplicate everything, right?
It's always N+1, yeah. So
N+1. So now that doesn't quite qualify as an acronym. I've warned you that acronyms always have to be explained here, but what is N+1?
For any system, it means that one part of the system can go down, or you could be maintaining one part of the system and still maintain 100% of the load to the rack.
And only N+1, you're not doing N+2 where 2 things could fail simultaneously.
There are some scenarios where you might have 14 fan wall units that do the cooling at the rack level. And you might, because there were so many of them, you might put in N+2 to make sure that you have, our job is to make sure we have 99.999% of resiliency.
Five nines,
basically. Yeah. So you do some calculations to see whether you need to be N+1 or N+2 for any bit of equipment.
And I guess once you've got multiple buildings, you can also do it through moving things between buildings, depending on which clients you've got and so on.
When we talk about the cooling for the entire campus, that will be a huge shared infrastructure. We'll have a large heat exchanger building, which allows us to pass the seawater through these titanium plated heat exchangers and then back to the sea. That'll be a shared infrastructure we use for the entire campus, again, allowing us to not only operate more effectively, but also keep the costs down.
Let's go a bit deeper on cooling, because there's a shift going on from the earlier versions of these GPUs, which could be air cooled, because they were generating a lot at the time. You probably thought it was huge amounts of heat. We're talking about 3, 4, 5 years ago. Now they're getting so powerful that you're starting to have to cool them with liquid to the chip. So and the liquid is water to the back of the rack.
Exactly.
So you're simultaneously making that shift from air cooling to the chip to water cooling to the chip, right?
Exactly. So at the IT level, we need to, as I said, maintain the temperature of the chips. And you can do that through two methods: blowing cold air through the rack, and that can maintain the temperature if the rack isn't too power hungry. That works up to 20, 30 kilowatt racks, no problem. But once they start to get up to sort of 50, 60 kilowatts a rack, you need to find some supplementary cooling.
And 20, 30 kilowatts, I mean, I'm just remembering, when I was a kid, we had an electric heater in case actually from before we had central heating. And you had these sort of filaments that would glow red and warm the room. And each filament was 1 kilowatt. So you've got a rack. These are batteries, but a rack which sort of looks a bit
similar
like
size.
this, similar size. And you're saying that, it was sort of 20, 30, up to 60 kilowatts, so like 60 one-bar electric stoves.
Well, you can imagine.
And those are now considered kind of little and pathetic and old, right?
Exactly. So you can imagine the next generation of racks that we'll be installing now for our customers, 130 kilowatts a rack. So imagine 130 of those red filaments in one place. It's pretty hard to keep them cool.
And what about the next generation? How do you future-proof? I mean, it's not going to stop, right?
No, so we build flexibility into the building itself. We're not here to just supply power and cooling for the next generation of chips. These buildings are designed for 15, 20 years, maybe even 25. But we fully expect that in 5, 10 years' time, the racks will go from 100 kilowatts a rack to a megawatt and maybe even more. So the amount of space we need to actually install those racks will go down and down and down. But the amount of space that we need to provide the electrical equipment to support the racks will increase. So we're just repurposing the space so that we can hopefully increase the capacity of each of the buildings.
So in the end, you'll end up with a quantum computer surrounded by an absolutely colossal amount of cooling and cabling as well. We haven't talked about that.
Exactly.
So the electrical connections, let's go a little deeper on that. As we walked here, we saw, rooms full of spaghetti. And when I say spaghetti, I mean, we're talking about cables like that. Rob, where are we? What have we got here?
Okay, so now we're in the electrical switch rooms. This is where all the power comes into the building, and we provide the resilient power to the data hall space. So we bring the power in at 11 kilovolts, then comes into a ring main unit.
Is that the big cable up at the...
That's the big red cable there. It comes into a ring main unit and a transformer, and then it transforms down to 400 volts, and then that supports the data hall itself. So you've got the switchboards here.
Yep.
They send the power via busbar to the data halls. We're running, I think, 2 megawatt busbars here. So each of these switchboards provides 2 megawatts of power to the data hall. And we have UPSs here. So if there's ever a power outage at the grid level, there's no break at the IT level. So the UPSs pick up the load, and they're just there to make sure that the generators can then pick up the load to sustain that load.
How long does the UPS cover?
So we say end of life batteries will hold for 5 minutes, but generally it's between 7 and 10 minutes, which is more than enough time for the generators to
kick in. And so those are the battery rooms there?
Exactly.
So that's the UPS control, and then you've got the batteries.
Exactly, we've got the lithium ion batteries sitting in there behind those doors, and they support these UPS blocks here.
Would this place have been full? It must have been full of electricians at some point. I mean, every single cable better be right.
If the data center took us 18 months to build, 9 months of the hard work goes in here, making sure these cables are perfectly terminated, tested before we go operational.
So Rob, this is the kind of, the spaghetti room where you're actually still wiring it all up. Let's have a look. So
this is the work in progress.
And this is your... That is a lot of copper.
It's a lot of copper.
That's a lot of copper. That's incredible. Look at that. Although I wouldn't want to touch it while it was live.
No.
Try and... Yeah.
Please stay away from the live panels.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to... good. Amazing. Let's take it from the substation, because we'll talk about where the electricity comes from. But from the substation, how do you get that much power? It's going to be 1.2 gigawatts, and then it has to be broken down all the way down to the GPUs. How do you do that?
Exactly. So we're building our own large substation for the entire campus. This first building has a smaller substation, which is fully built. But if we start at the larger substation, we're taking 400 kilovolt power from the national grid.
So that's the power that will come on the really big pylon
Exactly. You can
runs.
see them as you're driving down the highway. Right. So we'll connect that into our own substation. Then we need to step that down to the next reasonable kilovoltage stage, which is, in this instance, 150 kilovolt. And then we'll take that, distribute it to each of the buildings. So they'll have 5 different buildings that each have their own substation. And then we can step down again to 22 kV. and then you distribute the power into the buildings from there. And once it's inside the building, then we have to make sure that it's fully resilient. So you not only have the power connection, but you make sure that you, in parallel, have UPS and you have generators.
Acronym klaxon, wait a minute. UPS,
uninterruptible power supply.
So, and that's what this is. This is the battery room
These
for
are the battery
UPS.
rooms that support the UPSs. So we have UPSs in this building, initially 2 megawatts per block. We'll step up to 2.5 megawatts per block. But in this room, you're seeing 2 megawatts worth of batteries that can keep the customer's load running for up to 10 minutes, but at the end of life, 5 minutes. Now, that's only there so the generators can start running. And the generators will pick up the load and then we'll transfer onto generators while.
So if there's a problem, the first thing is immediately over to the batteries, and then you've got 5 or initially 10, but as the battery life degrades, 5 minutes to get the generators running.
Exactly.
Okay. Just before we go to the generators, the chips run on 400 volts, AC or DC?
AC.
Okay. Interesting. So that's what you're doing within this building. You're going from, what did you say, 22 kV down to 400?
Down to 400,
right.
Yeah.
And transformers or solid state chips to do all of that? How is that done?
So it's done with transformers, traditional transformers.
Traditional transformers, because power electronics is getting very clever these days.
Yeah, exactly. And we expect that moving forward in a few years' time, when we're talking about 1 megawatt racks and 2 megawatt racks, we will be looking at DC. We will be talking about potentially powering them at an MV level, not at an LV level. So medium voltage instead of low voltage. And that's coming, and that'll be a better use of capex. That'll be a better use of space in the future.
And what temperature do the racks and the chips operate at? You're keeping it at what?
Historically, they like to be 24 to 26 degrees Celsius, but I think there's been a bit of a push recently for efficiency reasons to try to increase that temperature. So more and more customers are willing to operate in the 27 to 32 degree range. Which is obviously a lot more efficient, requires a lot less power and a lot less cooling.
Cooling efficient, but of course there's a trade-off that the hotter the chips run, the shorter their lifetime.
Exactly, but there's been a lot of work done by NVIDIA and Intel and others to design chips that can run at those hotter temperatures.
What's the lifetime of a chip?
They're testing that at the moment, aren't they? So running these high compute AI models, I mean, the expectation is easily they'll run for 4 or 5 years, but I think there's a lot of people that are anticipating that they could run for 6 or 7 years.
I'm smiling as I ask that question because it's a controversial subject. There are some analysts are saying, that there's a huge problem here because actually they don't last very many. They don't last 4 or 5 years. And then there's others who say that they do. And my suspicion is they probably at the moment don't, but they will soon because you work on that reliability. Just as EVs or batteries or anything else, they started off with short lifetimes and then it got longer.
Exactly. There's different reasons why the lifetime might be reduced, maybe the environment they're installed in or the power fluctuations they're exposed to. So it's our job to try to make sure the environment, the power is stable for them.
Okay, we've got to talk about those generators. I drove past them. They are big, they're ugly, and they burn fossil fuels. I mean, you've got electricity that you'll be purchasing. These are just the backup generators we're talking about.
Exactly. So we hope that they only have to run in maintenance mode a few hours a year. Occasionally, they do need to kick in if there's a grid outage. But what we're trying to do is make sure we're using the most emission-free fuel that we can. So traditionally, people use diesel in the European market to support their generators. We're using an alternative fuel called hydrogenated vegetable oil, HVO.
Very good. You avoided just using the acronym HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil. So it's kind of diesel, but made from plant oils.
Exactly.
And do you store some of that on the site?
Yeah, so we make sure we always have 24 hours of fuel storage here for our generators, and then we have a local supplier that can top that up if we ever have an outage.
Do you need to run them when they're not needed? Do you need to, each year, are there a certain number of hours or days that you need to run them?
Yeah, exactly, but it's a few hours a year, it's not too much.
And that's enough to back up the whole plant. So you will ultimately have 1.2 gigawatts of those generators.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. Increasingly, some of the customers that are running AI training are more willing to run a smaller number of their GPUs with generator backup. So They try to split the load into critical and not as critical, and we make sure that we have generators to back up the really critical tasks, and some of the non-critical tasks that could stop and start again aren't generator backed.
You've got 24 hours of on-site HVO storage. 24 hours is not that long. I mean, you could do that if you were using batteries. Certainly if it was 4 hours, you wouldn't bother with all of that. You would just do batteries. But by the time battery costs come down a chunk more, 24 hours you could do with batteries. I suppose that's the worst case scenario where you can't buy any more, you can't get any more HVO delivered, right?
So the 24 hours is there to make sure that even if there was a hiccup in the supply chain, that you could find a second supplier to bring in the fuel. And even if we can't use HVO, we could easily just put in diesel. So that allows for the supply chain to keep filling up those tanks. And we're planning for a worst case disaster here where you've got a few days where the grid's out. Now, it's very unlikely to happen, but you need to make sure that the customers are supported in that scenario. It's no secret there was a power outage here a few months ago in Iberia.
28th of April.
Exactly. I was landing on a flight from Australia and wondered what the hell was going on. I landed to a complete blackout in Lisbon and couldn't work out what was happening.
It has to be noted, by the way, that the entire, not just country, not just Portugal, but Portugal and Spain got their grids back up from a black start in 12 hours.
Which is pretty impressive, considering the amount of infrastructure that was taken down.
Incredibly good. And you have to believe that now they've done that actual run, that next time it would be even quicker. I mean, that is enormously impressive. I think it's important to note that.
And I think they've learned a lot from that in the sense of decoupling the two grids as well. But what I can say from a data center level was it really gave us a great test of our facility. So we'd already tested everything to make sure it worked. The UPSs were doing their thing, the generators kicked in, the supply chain kicked in as it should, and our operations team were absolutely flawless. They didn't miss a beat.
And my suspicion is that if you have 24 hours on site for the whole site, that what you'd actually do is have many more hours for the bits that really matter, and you would differentiate, not necessarily try and keep everything going in that sort of utterly disaster scenario.
If there was an issue with getting the supply, but we had, I think being on HVO actually worked to our advantage. So while all the hospitals were scrapping around for diesel, we had HVO. We were one of the only people in Portugal that was running on HVO. So we had trucks full of HVO coming our way whenever we needed them.
Cleaning Up is supported by its leadership circle. The members are Actis, Alcazar Energy, Arup, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Eurelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse the archive of over 200 past episodes, and also to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live. Okay, so we've been through what you're building, the cooling, the electrical system, the backup, but let's talk about the power supply. So there was talk in this project about various plots of land where you could be building solar, but I think now, if I'm right, the plan is to let other people do that and then purchase from them, and also via the grid, a load of other sources of electricity. So talk through what the power mix will be.
Okay, so the way that we've started is to get access to the grid. We've got our connections to the grid. We started by buying power from the grid while we were waiting to secure the customers and build up the load, and hence the eventual demand for the grid. So we're now both purchasing power from the grid. We have PPAs in place, power purchase agreements in place for this first facility, and we'll increase those PPAs as we grow the load in the facility.
And so a PPA, that is, you go out to somebody else whose business is developing wind, developing solar, and then you sign a contract that says, right,
Exactly.
We'll buy that.
Exactly. We tell them we're going to buy 2 megawatts or 4 megawatts over this period, and that gives them the investment they need to complete their project. So we're supporting the growth of those solar, wind, and hopefully hydro projects through Portugal. We'll continue to do that as we grow out, but eventually we'd also like to supplement that with some direct wire projects. Whether we do them ourselves or we do it in partnership with a local developer, that will depend on the economics, and it'll depend on the complexity of the build. And we're a data center builder, but we want to make sure that we're supplementing the grid.
So you have still got the option on that land, so you could still do the private wire projects.
We have a number of options in the region, and we're talking to a number of people that are already planning and have permits for wind and solar projects.
So what percentage, in that 2030, 1.2 gigawatt data center all humming away, what percentage of the electricity at that point would be clean, would be renewables?
So it's already 100% renewable, but there's various different ways that you can cut that, right? But we need to make sure we've got 100% renewables, but we also want to make sure that we can do that in a demonstrable way. We also want to make sure that we're supplementing the grid and not just taking the renewable power off the grid. So our ambition is to make sure for every gigawatt of load that we're using, that we've supplemented that in some way through direct wire agreements or PPA agreements.
So additional new build renewables. Okay, now you need a big grid connection, and that's one of the uniquenesses of this site, is that it used to be a massive coal-fired power station. And the extraordinary coincidence is that yesterday, just as we were arriving here, they knocked down the chimneys of the power station. So have you inherited a whole load of the infrastructure? Because that was definitely part of the plan, wasn't it?
We have, and that was one of the unique things about this site, and what made it so appealing in the first place was there was already that infrastructure in place. It already had, the transmission cabling coming from the grid. It already had an amazing cooling system. It was a 3 gigawatt coal-fired power plant that was completely cooled by the seawater. So we've been able to repurpose that existing cooling infrastructure, and we'll be using that not only in this building but in the future buildings.
And it's not just physical infrastructure; it's the permits to be able to extract water and put it back into the sea and all those sorts of things, right?
Exactly, and we're going to be doing it well within the limits that they were allowed to do it 40, 50 years ago. We're making sure we're doing it in a much more sustainable way.
That brings us to kind of what makes a good data center. If you look at, the press is full of people who are building data centers. It's the front page of everything. And they're not going to be equally good in terms of whatever criteria your customers are using. And they're not going to be equally future-proofed. So first of all, the customers that are going to be using this facility, putting their chips in it, what are they looking for? Because there's a whole bunch of different things going on right now in terms of costs and this and speed and so on. What are they looking for? How are they weighting the different components?
So I think the first baseline is, are you designing, do you have the ability to deliver a resilient data center? And you need to make sure you have the team to support that, the experience to support that, hopefully some sort of product that you can show them that you're actually able to do that. That's the baseline.
Your project has to be real, which is not a trivial sort of criterion these days.
Quite important to say that you have more than a concept. So that's the baseline. If you can pass that test, then the most important things they're looking for are low total cost of ownership, so low capex that we translate into rent for them, but I'll explain the business model around that later. Low operational cost. So can we maintain the facility in an efficient way? Will they get low power costs through the grid? Do we have low cooling costs? And then time to market. Time to market is so important in this AI race at the moment. If you can deliver a data center within 18 months, then you're in a much better position than someone that has only just started their design.
Presumably, some thought about the future and future proofing and will it work for the next generation of chips and those sorts of things. But if they had 100 points to allocate between, let's say the baseline is it has to be a real project, but then 100 points to allocate between speed, cost and future proofing, right now, where are your customers? How many points are they putting on each?
I think speed is at least half of that. I think cost is probably equally weighted with future-proofing. They are very focused on making sure they can deliver and support the demand that they're seeing from different AI workloads. So they want to make sure they can deliver those GPUs that they have allocated for the next 18 months, and they can get them up and running, and they don't have them sitting on a shelf somewhere, because, as I said, it's billions of euros in that IT equipment alone.
And it's becoming obsolete because NVIDIA is going to launch its next generation of
Exactly.
chips.
They need to get them to work and monetize them.
50% speed, 25% cost, 25% future proofing, which is going to be essentially around future costs and so on. And the costs are the power cost and the cooling cost, or the total budget for power, which includes all of the cooling stuff. So seawater versus air cooling versus what others are doing, is that what makes this such a special location and plant and data center?
It does, because it's going to reduce the power cost by 20 to 30%.
You can do PUEs, the acronym PUE. So what's seawater versus?
So we anticipate that seawater will give us a power usage effectiveness, the PUE, of around 1.1. And traditional data centers are running at a PUE of around 1.3. And that 1.3 is the ratio of the total power usage for the IT power and the cooling over just the IT power.
So turning the mathematics around, that means that by going from air cooling to seawater, you're essentially reducing the power budget by about 20%.
Exactly.
And so that is, over the life of a facility like this, is pretty interesting.
It's a big factor if you consider that they're spending as much on renting the data center as they are on power sometimes in the more expensive power markets. So the power bill could be as much as the rent, and it's a big factor.
What about the future-proofing piece? Because how can I put this? There are some players in this industry who don't seem to care nearly as much about what happens in 2 years' time or 4 years' time or 6 years' time. They are so focused, perhaps more than 50% of their weighting seems to be on speed.
Yeah, and often you're seeing that with the end users themselves. I mean, Meta's an example that are throwing up tents to put their GPUs to work, and that's great. And that's a great way of getting the building up and running within a few months. Our business model is a little bit different. We're building for the investors for the long term. So we're here to support the next 5, 10 years of AI deployments. But in 10, 15, 20 years, this building also needs to be ready to support cloud and other IT services. So we need to build in that flexibility.
But it's a fascinating moment in sort of economic history, because you have a whole bunch of, not just a whole bunch of companies, you have trillions of dollars going into facilities like this that have got lives potentially of 20, 30, 40 years, but an unbelievable focus on what happens in the next year or two. Let's move on to the business model of your customers and your contracts with your customers. Are they coming to you and saying, Rob, I just want something for a year or two because we're in this race? Or are they signing 20, 30, 40 year, we're in this for the long term type contracts?
So that's a bit of a live discussion. I think the industry's going through a bit of a change at the moment. Historically, for smaller, say if someone takes a data hall out of a larger data center that we're in today, they might sign a 5 to 7 year lease agreement.
That would be a sort of classic FLAP-D, more the real estate model, based in London or Frankfurt, 5-year lease.
Yeah, but anywhere in this mode where the developer's leasing the space to a hyperscaler or to another customer, they would sign a 5 to 7 year lease for use of that space. And then you would expect, and they generally do, they would renew that lease and keep going. When you're talking about building a whole new data center out of the ground, our next one, which will cost 1.5 to 2 billion euros, you need to make sure you have a very strong anchor tenant. So we're not going to go and be able to raise 1.5 billion euros of debt without knowing that we're going to get that paid back over a period. So we need to make sure that we have a good lease in place with a very creditworthy tenant. And that's the discussion the industry is having at the moment.
But you need a tenant with a strong balance sheet, but you also need more than 5 years of guaranteed income, right? The lease has to go beyond 5 years to build a facility like this.
No, exactly. So when you're building something out of the ground and you're doing that for one customer or with that one customer as an initial anchor tenant, then you would expect that lease to be 10 plus years.
Okay, so the customer environment, and we all talk about the hyperscalers, right? So you've got the Amazons and the Googles and the Metas and the OpenAI now, and Oracle, there's Apple. I'm not sure I've got them all, but there's those. There is a sort of second tier, which I think is called the Neo Cloud. There's a bunch of people, CoreWeave and a whole load of, I don't want to say it, but yeah, CoreWeave clones that are, springing up. Whose balance sheet ultimately, you also have investors, Davidson Kempner, but also, everybody's, all the private equity infra funds, whose balance sheet actually underwrites the building of these data centers?
It's a combination of things. There's lots of different deals being done where either there's a backstop of an end customer with a higher investment grade, or there's equity being put in at the Neo Cloud level that's supporting some of the initial investment, or there's a three-party agreements being put in place. There's multiple different things being experimented with, if I put it that way, in the industry at the moment.
Right, but it's a little bit of a Spider-Man meme where everybody sort of says, use their balance sheet. Because, yes, of course, CoreWeave's got some equity, but they don't want to build with equity. You don't want to build with equity. The hyperscalers could build with equity, but they can't do trillions and trillions of building just using their equity value. I mean, can we build the number of data centers that people are planning?
I think we'll build as many data centers as are needed to run the loads. So the AI demand is we're seeing, and is actually being monetized, right? But I think the hyperscalers you talk about can build a few data centers, a few gigawatt data centers a year, but they also need to supplement their growth with the support of people like us and people like the Neo Clouds that can go and anticipate that demand, can go and pre-purchase GPUs, can go and get joint ventures in place or start building shells so that when that demand comes to the hyperscaler or the OpenAI, there is somewhere to put that demand.
And of course, there's another player in this, which is, of course, the sovereign wealth funds. And there's, there are balance sheets out there. It just feels like a really fascinating question of who's actually, in the end, standing behind this for long enough for a facility like this to be built. I want to move on to another topic, which, as I say, when I wrote that Green Giants report, we spent a lot of time thinking about it, which is how do you play nicely with the community, with the grid and the local community? Do you know whether you're regarded as a kind of net benefit or a net problem? Because we hear in the news, some of the data centers are very much regarded as bad actors. And are you a bad actor? Are you seen as a bad actor here in Sines?
I don't think so. If you look around you, we're in a very industrial zone. There was a big effort made decades ago to revitalize this area with a number of industries. The coal-fired power plant was one, but also there's a lot of LNG refinery going on around here. We're now entering a new phase of development in this area with the coal-fired power plant being decommissioned. We're coming in, there's a number of other industries. There's a battery manufacturing plant being put up nearby. These are all seen as greener industries. I think people are excited about what we're bringing. We're bringing revitalization, hopefully, of the local community by helping build additional housing. We're trying at best to use as many local people to support not only the construction of this data center, but also the operation of it after it's built. And we're working with those local schools and then more widely universities to try to upskill people to support this, to take them from an LNG plant or a coal-fired power plant into operating a data center.
But it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because you can say, we're creating all these jobs, they should love us, but you're also using all the electricians in the region, right?
We are, but there also needs to be people brought into the region, and those people will hopefully want to stay. And again, that brings another form of revitalization.
Are you finding the people on the site, which are not just yours, but lots of contractors, are there lots of sort of Portuguese who have been expats? They've been working in London, or they've been working in the US, or they've been, are they now, is the sort of the diaspora being summoned back to Portugal because finally you've got a huge project that's worth working on here?
Exactly. That's been a huge benefit for us. I mean, people learned about our project. not only through your white paper, but since some of the early announcements. And they were off building data centers for hyperscalers in Finland and South America and Asia. And they heard about the project and they thought, I'm ready to come back to Portugal now. There's a project here for me. And that's been amazing. We've got so many Portuguese natives that have come back for that.
That must be quite gratifying, because you're almost like reunifying families, and there must be some people quite grateful that there is this reason to come back to Europe.
I think they are, and then the expats as well are pretty grateful. I'm pretty grateful to be able to build a data center in such an amazing country.
How many people are actually going to be on site? What was the peak when this was being built, or is it at peak today? And what will it? Are we talking hundreds? Are we talking thousands?
So when this first building was going up, we were peaking at about 600 people. For the next one, we're looking at about 1,500 to 2,000 people. And if we're building more than one data center at a time, that number could go up to 3,000 to 4,000.
And these people, some of them will be essentially moving here. I mean, it's an eight years. I mean, I don't know, are you moving here? Have you already moved? Is this where you live?
When after I did my due diligence on the company and read your white paper and decided to quit my job at Digital Realty, I was all in. I decided to move to Portugal straight away.
So that is, at peak, you're going to be a few thousand people with their families. I mean, yeah, you better build some housing, right? Otherwise you will be unpopular.
Exactly. And there's a number of private and public initiatives to make sure that happens quickly. I mean, I think you saw a little bit in Sines last night. There's a lot of cranes up and a lot of apartment buildings going up, and hopefully that continues.
How much time do you spend with the local municipality, the mayor, the councillors?
It's an important part of not only the permitting process, but also just the wider community process. So we're spending as much time with them as we can.
And then coming to the grid, you said you want it to be additional renewables. It all sounds great, right? It's marvelous. You'll be building new renewables and so on. But how do you make sure that you're not a net pain in the backside for the grid? Because obviously you used to have a coal-fired power station, fine, yeah, but it used to pump out electricity to power Portugal. Yeah. And now you're going to be at best neutral, and maybe occasionally requiring huge amounts of, I don't know, hydro. So everybody wants the hydro, right? Yeah. So you can make it sound very nice and, oh, we're nice and green, but at some point you are contracting the hydro to keep these servers going, and that will not be available to keep people charging their EVs or running their businesses or their, heating or whatever.
Oh, exactly. I think the hydro point's important, and we're not rejecting the idea of putting in large battery storage at some point if we need to. But I think what the TSO did very well a couple of years ago, they started looking at all the off-takers in the local region and to see which projects were really going ahead, which projects were paper projects, just to see how much transmission they would have to put in, and then obviously talking with the power generators as well to make sure there were as many solar and wind projects coming online as they would need to be able to support that load growth. So we've been really transparent with them about when we think we're going to be using the power. Yes, we've committed to making sure that we sign up to PPAs so those projects do go ahead on time, but we need to do it in a sensible way as we grow our load.
Now you've also got 1.2 gigawatts, not yet, but you will have 1.2 gigawatts of backup generators that we've established will be running a few hours a year. And what will those also be available to support the local grid? Because there'll be times when if there's no wind, no sun, whatever, you might need them, but so might the local, everybody locally, not just, I don't want to kind of overtrade the idea, but the hospital and the police cars need to be charged and the ambulance. Is there a scenario where you just say, look, we're actually going to make that available to the grid?
Well, these are other things that we're looking at hand in hand. I think first and foremost, we would like not to have to install all the generators. We've planned for them, but we do hope that we'll work more closely with our customers to only put generators supporting the load, the absolute critical load. Not 100% of their load is always the critical load that needs to be running in every scenario. So we'll work with them to try to phase out some of the generators. And if we have to install the generators and then they're not all needed for critical load, then we could look at potentially offering them up in a critical scenario.
I want to get on to just a final sort of question, which is to sort of step back from all this. And it's an extraordinary development. in its scale, in its ambition, and it really does sound. I mean, I'm trying to sort of slightly find the weak points, and it's very impressive. You yourself, you got into this industry 20 years ago, and you have an engineering background, right? There was this not sleepy backwater, but it was a very kind of crunchy, develop these projects, build the data centers, and you saw it through from the early years of the cloud and so on. And suddenly you're in the absolute, and it's not even the eye of the storm, it's the middle of the storm. How does that feel? Is it weird?
It's very weird. Like, for me, it never felt like a backwater, because the projects are so intense and they move so fast that it always felt intense, an intense industry to me.
So 5 megawatts of data center back in 2003 or 2005 felt pretty extraordinary.
The first one I did was the biggest one in Europe at the time. It was for a banking institution, and it was actually designed to go up to 24 megawatts, but that made it the biggest one in Europe at the time. And it was massive.
Where was that?
That was up in the north of England. And I moved to Leeds for a couple of years for that project. But I was so excited about...
The great financial centre of the UK, which is Leeds. There's an enormous amount there.
Exactly.
I'm not joking. That's
exactly.
An important centre. Yeah.
Exactly. But I was fascinated by the speed of the project and how much capital needed to be poured into a relatively short time frame. So it was put up in 18 months, and it was almost 300 million pounds at the time, and it was fascinating. So it didn't feel like a backwater. It felt very intense to me, and it was very demanding, and it's been like that ever since. I think the demand for data centers is going up and up and up. That's undeniable. Yes, there's a lot of hype around AI at the moment, and we'll see where that goes. But I still think the growth in demand for data centers isn't going to go anywhere.
Yesterday, not only were the chimneys of the coal-fired power station coming down, but Rick Perry, the former Secretary of Energy in the US, has got a company called Fermi, and Fermi was IPO'd. It is a data center developer. I'm not sure that they've got more than what you've got here, because you started this 4 years ago and have actually got a data center. We've walked through it. It exists. It is phase 1 of a 1.2 gig. And he IPO'd that. He sold 4% of the business for $600 million on the NASDAQ and the London Stock Exchange. Very nice to see London playing there. But a $15 billion valuation for a set of data centers, which is kind of less real than what we're seeing here today. Do you look at that and go, yes, I knew it would always be like this. This is the new dawn. Or do you look at that and go, holy moly, we're in uncharted and possibly quite dangerous territory here?
Yeah, as I said, I look at that and think, okay, there are some projects that are over-promising, and I think that the timescale on that project just seems incredibly rapid. And yes, I'm sure it'll go ahead, and I'm sure it'll be successful.
I mean, he's talking about 1 gig by 2026.
Incredibly quick.
So forget the 8 years.
Incredibly quick.
Incredibly quick.
But I think if we continue to build sustainable, future-facing data centers with flexibility, we'll be successful. And there's a lot of demand that's coming to Europe, so I don't even think we've seen the big wave in Europe yet. I think it's coming.
How quickly did Elon build his gigawatt data center? That was very, very quick. So it can be done.
That was in less than a year. That can be done.
If you build that fast, can it be future-proofed the way this place is future-proofed?
I think you're going to have a lot of problems, because once you have an operational data center, it's very hard to fix any mistakes you might have made along the way. You need to, if you're looking at a future-proofed data center that wants to run for 20 years, you need to make sure that every cable is terminated perfectly, everything is tested before you switch it on, because it's very hard to do anything once things are running.
So to a certain extent, are you sort of doing things, the right way, slightly, I would say, the traditional way, and just watching these people with a bit of bemusement?
I think there's space for both of us in the industry, but I think our goal is to be here for many, many years to come.
And one element of future-proofing is if AI ends up, I don't want to say not, because it's clearly real and it's clearly going to be, transformational. But if it ends up just not needing as many data centers, maybe it's more efficient than anybody thought, or there's some, the model structures, continue to evolve, DeepSeek type innovation. What happens to this place in that scenario?
then this place will end up running as a combination. It'll be running AI training, AI inference, other cloud products. As I said, there'll still be a need for these large-scale data centers. That thesis that you wrote 4 years ago is still completely true. These data centers are needed.
Although it's incredibly expensive, it will be a low-cost provider. Is that the idea?
Well, this is not a very expensive data center. The main expense, as we said before, is the GPUs they're bringing in, right?
Rob, it's been a great pleasure. Absolutely fascinating to visit. And thank you very, very much for spending time with us and for allowing us to wander around, not everywhere because we didn't get into the client rooms, but it was really interesting.
Thank you so much for hosting me, and it's been a pleasure to host you here.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
So that was Rob Dunn, CEO of Start Campus, a portfolio company of Davidson Kempner, who are, of course, a member of our leadership circle. Since recording this episode, news broke that Microsoft will be making a $10 billion investment into the Start Campus CNES data center. We'll put a link to the press release about that in the show notes, alongside links to the white paper on very large out-of-town data centers that I co-authored and edited, entitled Green Giants. Also, the Cleaning Up audio blog I wrote on generative AI, read by my alter ego Mike Headroom, The Power and the Glory, and a link to the Start Campus website. With that, it remains for me to thank our producer, cameraman, and drone operator, Oscar Boyd, video editor, Jamie Oliver, the team behind Cleaning Up, the Leadership Circle, who make all of this possible, and you, the audience, for spending some time here with us today. Please join us this time next week for another episode of Cleaning Up. Cleaning Up is supported by its Leadership Circle. The members are Actis, Alcazar Energy, Arup, Signum Capital, Davidson Kempner, Ecopragma Capital, EDP of Portugal, Euroelectric, the Gilardini Foundation, KKR, National Grid, Octopus Energy, Quadrature Climate Foundation, SDCL, and Wärtsilä. For more information on the Leadership Circle, please visit cleaningup.live. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit like, leave a comment, and also recommend it to friends, family, colleagues, and absolutely everyone. To browse the archive of over 200 past episodes, and also to subscribe to our free newsletter, visit cleaningup.live. That's cleaningup.live.